Hello, I'm Dr. Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, and I'm happy to be joining you today to talk about the findings from a new survey report, Abortion Views in All 50 States, which are findings from our 2024 Americans Values Atlas. I'm also delighted to welcome two of our public fellows this year, PRRI Public Fellows Ann Whitesell and Michal Raucher. And in fact, I'd like them to introduce themselves before I start with an overview of some of the major findings from the report. I'd encourage you also, after the report, to please go online. You can find our report. There's much more information and more analysis to be found there. But in the meantime, let me turn the mic over to Ann and then to Michal, and then we'll start with my presentation. Ann.
Hi, I'm Ann Whitesell. I'm an assistant professor of political science at Miami University in Ohio. I'm also our associate director of the Menard Family Center for Democracy, and I study American politics and public policy. I'm here today because in part I've been studying the pro-life movement and ballot initiatives around reproductive rights. Michal?
Thanks, Ann. Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Michal Raucher. I am an associate professor of Jewish studies at Rutgers University. And I'm part of this group because I've been researching abortion experiences among Jews, Christians, and Muslims for the last few years. I'm a researcher and anthropologist of religion and reproduction with a focus on Jews. And I'm really excited to discuss this data today.
Thank you both. Well, let's go ahead and turn to that data. And I'm going to provide, again, an overview and a PowerPoint of some of the major takeaways from this study. So I wanted to first start off by talking about the methodology of the survey. One of the things that's so valuable about the American Values Atlas is that it has more than 22,000 interviews annually. And so it's a really rich treasure trove of data, and we're able to really get at a granular level Americans' attitudes within all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So it makes it a very kind of unprecedented source of data. It also means that the margin of error is very small with such a large sample size. It's less than one plus or minus 1 percentage point. I'd also like to acknowledge the generous support of Michelle Mercer and Bruce Goldman for funding the research today. All right, let's take a look at the larger overview of Americans' abortion views over time. PRRI has been tracking American attitudes about abortion since 2010. And in 2010, if you look at the gray line, that represents the views of all Americans. We found that about 55% of Americans said that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And one of the trends that you'll notice, even irrespective of party, is that Americans have become broadly more supportive of abortion legality over time. So we've gone from 54%, roughly 55% in 2010 to 63% of Americans supporting abortion legality. And as you can see, there is partisan polarization when it comes to abortion. That shouldn't be any surprise to those who follow politics in America today. We know that Democrats and Republicans have very different views on lots of issues, including abortion. But what's noticeable here is that that gap between partisans, Democrats and Republicans, has really grown from about 36 percentage points to just in the last year to a divide of about 46 percentage points. So it's, again, one more reflection of how party polarization has really, I think, come into play into the views of partisans on many issues, including abortion. I would also notice, too, that there's been a rise in support for abortion legality among independents. And if you go into the larger research report, you kind of track that a little bit. But really, from 2022 onward, we've seen a noticeable uptick among independents for support for abortion legality. And 2022, of course, is notable because that, of course, was the year of the Dobbs decision, which really has shaken up abortion politics nationally. We are, of course, the Public Religion Research Institute, so a lot of our analysis considers how religion shapes people's attitudes about a variety of issues, including abortion. And so here, I think the big takeaway is that the most support for abortion legality comes from Americans who are religiously unaffiliated. However, most people of faith in this country, those who profess a religious identity, tend to be broadly supportive of abortion rights as well. We tend to find that the largest amount of support comes from religious minorities in the country, from Unitarians to Buddhists to Hindus and American Jews. But we also find that strong majorities of Black Protestants, white mainliners, and Catholics are broadly supportive of abortion legality as well. At the same time, there are religious groups in America who are less supportive of abortion legality, including what we find in our analysis, Jehovah's Witnesses, Latter-day Saints, and white evangelical Protestants. Hispanic Protestants have become more conservative on a variety of indicators, including abortion as well, and a slight minority of Hispanic Protestants support abortion legality currently. Next, we're going to look at that data at the state level. And so there are a couple of heat maps that I wanted to share with you in this presentation. And the first heat map looks at that indicator of abortion legality, should abortion be legal in all or most cases across all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And I think what's noticeable here is that there is a wide variety of opinion when it comes to state level attitudes on abortion legality. And if you were to superimpose a map of the Electoral College, for example, you would find that states that broke heavily for Kamala Harris in 2024 tend to be far more supportive of abortion legality, including, for example, in Vermont, 8 in 10 Vermonters support abortion legality. But you see on the West Coast as well, and in the Northeast, trends toward more support for abortion legality. At the same time, states that broke more heavily for Donald Trump tend to be less supportive of abortion legality. But even here, there are a number of states where we fall below that 50% threshold, but not necessarily huge numbers of state residents opposing abortion legality. One, though, if you look at the conversation, we know, of course, in the battlegrounds like Michigan and Wisconsin, North Carolina, Georgia, we find, though, Donald Trump won those states, but really strong majorities of state residents still supported abortion rights. Next, we're going to look at sort of the flip here and look at Americans who think that abortion should be essentially banned. So this is opposition to abortion legality by state. And here we see a much different looking map than before, right? The heat map, the darker blue, tends to indicate, I think, more progressive or liberal positions. Here we're looking at a heat map where the darker color indicates more opposition to abortion legality entirely. So essentially support for banning abortion. And I think what's notable here is that in no state do more than 17% of residents basically think that abortion should be banned, is what we're looking at. By contrast, really what we're seeing in most states are light green, where fewer than 10% of residents, in fact, say that abortion should be banned. I have my eye, for example, on Wisconsin. If you look at the very top there, there is, of course, a critical election happening in terms of a judicial election in that state. Abortion is one of the issues that's being talked about as being important to that election campaign. Here we find in Wisconsin last year, just 5% of Wisconsinians, I think that's right, said that they opposed abortion. As you might very well be aware, if you're watching this webinar, the stakes of the politics around abortion have really changed in wake of the Dobbs decision. And we have a situation, of course, where that policy has to the states, and we have states that have either completely banned the procedure in effect, maybe except for the rare exception to save a mother's life, or we have states that have imposed very restrictive gestational limits on the access to the procedure, say allowing abortion only in the case of pregnancy that would be maybe 6 weeks or less, a time when a lot of women aren't even aware that they might be pregnant yet, whereas other states tend to have much less restrictive policies. And in fact, some states have a very least restrictive policy here. And one of the things we did was, and this data actually comes from the Guttmacher Institute, we categorized those states from those that are completely essentially banning abortion to those that have the least restrictive measures. And I think what's really interesting to note here, certainly states where the procedure has been banned tend to have higher levels of support for banning abortion in all or most cases. But even in those states, a majority of state residents say that they support abortion legality in all or most cases. So I think that's really a good indicator of how the public opinion surrounding the policies are very much out of step with states have banned or have made abortion very, very restrictive to access. So one of the things we did with this report is, this is maybe the third or fourth year that we've had a 50-state report. So sometimes we like to change the analytical lens just a little bit. And so here we're providing you some data on those Americans who are abortion supporters versus those who are abortion opponents. So here, if you look to the very left, we have these donut rings here. We see that among Americans writ large, if you look at partisanship, Americans are evenly divided between red and blue. About 29% of Americans in our American Values Atlas said they were Democrats. Another 29% said they were Republicans. The rest are split among independents and those who don't express a party option. But if you look to the right of that, we've broken down abortion legality supporters and abortion legality opponents. And it probably is not surprising to you to find, in fact, that among those who oppose abortion in all or most cases, more than half of those Americans are Republicans, whereas those who support abortion legality, only about 18% are Republicans. And then, of course, you see not quite a mirror effect, but you do see that about 40% of abortion supporters are Democrats. If you look down to the next layer of analysis, we're looking at the gender divide. And historically, can you go back, Colleen? Historically, we know that gender typically hasn't mattered as much to abortion attitudes, but yet we're seeing in more recent years a gender divide emerging, whereas women tend to be more supportive of abortion rights compared to men, even though men overall are still largely supportive of abortion legality. But here, if you look at abortion legality supporters, we find about 53% are women, 47% are men, and it's really the mirror image when it comes to abortion legality opponents. And finally, we're seeing increasingly an education divide in American politics that also extends to abortion attitudes. And so while we find that about 2/3 of the country are not college graduates, we find that disproportionately those who oppose abortion are more likely not to be college graduates as opposed to having a 4-year degree. Whereas disproportionately among those who support abortion, you tend to find more highly educated or those with a 4-year degree amongst that group of Americans. We do the same sort of thing when it comes to looking at a religious profile of abortion legality supporters and opponents here. Again, to the left, that first bar, that what you see is it's a breakdown of Americans religiously. So for example, that big 28%, those are Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated. The top, for example, we find that about 14% of Americans in our 20,000 K American Values Atlas, in fact, are white evangelical Protestants. So I'm going to look at those two numbers in particular, those two categories in particular, because if you look at abortion legality supporters, they're disproportionately more likely to be Americans who are unaffiliated, 36% compared to 28% overall. Whereas among abortion legality opponents, about 10% or 13% are unaffiliated. By contrast, you see, for example, among those who oppose abortion, they're disproportionately more likely to be white evangelical Protestants compared to the US population overall. And finally, we have a series here of donut charts, and I'm regretting not bringing my glasses here. It's very, very small, but I think the upshot is we're looking at American religious behavior. We know, and I know as someone who has written several peer-reviewed articles on abortion attitudes, that religiosity is often connected to people's views about abortion. Whether we're looking at, for example, church attendance, or how often people pray, or how often they're reading their scripture, or how often they're donating to churches, on all of these measures, we find that abortion opponents tend to be disproportionately more religious in their behavior compared to those who are abortion supporters. And that's kind of the picture that you're seeing overall in this set of graphs. What we did was we took those measures of religiosity and we compiled a scale, and we looked at religiosity in all 50 states. And here, because we love to do scatter plots at PRRI, we decided to plot attitudes about abortion legality versus the religiosity of different states. And here we see a negative correlation. So essentially, the more that a state is religious or has residents who are more religiously active in terms of going to church or synagogue or mosque or reading their scripture or praying, we find there's a negative relationship in terms of abortion support or support for abortion legality. A couple of outliers there. I think Alabama, for example, is a good outlier because we know that disproportionately there are more African Americans in Alabama, and African Americans tend to be more religious on lots of indicators. So that's one example of an outlier. But generally speaking, the trend is that the more a state has inhabitants that are frequently engaging in religious behaviors, the more likely they are not to be supportive of abortion legality. Last but not least, when it comes to scatter plots, let's look at Christian nationalism. We, of course, at PRRI are known for trying to measure the extent to which Americans embrace Christian nationalism ideology. And that, of course, is really just this idea that America was founded and should remain a Christian nation, and that the government should privilege conservative Christian views. And here again, another negative relationship. So if we look at states by their scores on Christian nationalism, so the higher the score, the more likely state residents subscribe to Christian nationalist beliefs, we again see a negative relationship here. And so if you are in a state where you have more Christian nationalist adherents or sympathizers, to use some of the language that we frequently use in our analyses here at PRRI, you find less support for abortion legality. Finally, we asked this year questions about the abortion pill or medication abortion. And so we find, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the discrepancy here, but we find that Americans are more opposed to laws that would make it illegal to access abortion pills by mail, 68%. And again, remember, at the beginning of the presentation, we find that 63% of Americans support abortion legality. So there is a little bit of some light here between more opposition to making it illegal to access the pills and the people that actually support abortion rights. And not surprisingly, we see similar sort of party breaks. Democrats are far more likely to oppose these bills compared to Republicans. Independents look more like Democrats, I think, on this issue. There are very few racial divides, although we do find Hispanic Americans tend to be more opposed to such laws. And again, that education also is relevant to this issue as well. Americans who have a college degree are more likely to oppose laws that make it illegal to access these pills compared to those who don't have a college degree. But again, almost 2/3 of Americans without a college degree still oppose such laws. And last but not least, we're looking at this by the religious divide that we often do at PRI. Very similar trends to what you saw earlier when it comes to general support for abortion legality. We find that most people of faith, and even here, half of white evangelical Protestants and 51% of Hispanic Protestants, and even slightly more Latter-day Saints, who typically oppose abortion legality in most or all cases, are finding at least some support for opposition to those laws that will try to make access to abortion by mail illegal. So that's a good, I think, summary of some of the highlights of the study. As I said at the beginning, please go and look at the report. There's much more analysis by age groups, by other sorts of facets in terms of public opinion. But at this point, I really just want to turn it over first to get the viewpoints of both Anne and Michal on when it comes to just their general thoughts on what we found in the report. And then we'll go into some more specific questions that I have for each of them. So why don't we start with Anne and then go with Michal.
Thanks, Melissa. So I wanted to touch on a few things that I think reflect larger trends that we see in political science. So the first one is Melissa talked about the partisan divide that we see in attitudes on abortion. And as Melissa said, some of this is polarization, right? We see that on lots of issues, Democrats and Republicans are divided. You saw in the graph that there's much more support from Democrats over the past few years. It's very high support for abortion legality. I think some of that might be because of what's known as partisan sorting. So people who do not affiliate with the beliefs of that party drop out of that party, right? So the Democrats have become known as the party that supports abortion rights. If you don't support abortion rights, you might be less likely to identify as a Democrat now. We know that more and more people are identifying as independents, are less likely to identify with one of the two major political parties. And so it kind of makes sense to me that we would see those who are still identifying as Democrats would be the ones who support abortion rights. I want to talk about the difference that we see in the states. So one of the things I study state politics. One of the things that we talk about in state politics is responsiveness, right? And we expect different things in the states because the states are different, right? California is very different from Alabama, et cetera. So in a representative democracy, the theory goes that your elected officials are going to be responsive to public opinion, right? They're going to have policies in place that reflect what the public wants. And because, again, California, is very different than Alabama, right? lots of Democrats in California, fewer Democrats, more Republicans in Alabama, right? We would expect that there would be policy differences across the states. Right? This is part of the reason why people argued that abortion should go back to the states, right? Is because there are very big differences across the states. But there's also limitations to this ability for responsiveness, right? So we see this when it comes to like gerrymandering, right? So, I mean, gerrymandering is a whole other topic we could talk about for days, but there's a limitation on how responsive you can be, right, when the districts are gerrymandered. And if you're a minority in the state, the electoral minority, right, then your voice can't be heard as easily, right? So while we do have some reflection of public opinion that happens in these states, it's not like a one-to-one. And we can talk a little bit more about that. I can talk about it when it comes to the like ballot initiatives that we've seen, because that's kind of our best example of matching policy with public opinion. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was just kind of how banning abortion is one policy option for solving the problem, right? The problem of abortion. But I think looking at how there's an increased support among Americans for abortion, regardless of party, might be part of understanding among all Americans that just banning abortion or restricting access to abortion does not necessarily solve the problem, right? It doesn't solve the underlying causes for why people get abortions. I've done a lot of interviews with pro-life activists, done a lot of research on pro-life groups, and some of these groups are very cognizant of this, and they in addition to focusing on restricting access to abortion, they're also looking at like what are the root causes, right, that drive people to get abortions. And so the policy choice then might be, how do we provide support so that people feel like they don't need an abortion, right? That they feel that they can keep the child, right? And so I think there's a difference between people saying, I don't personally support abortion, right? I wouldn't have an abortion, versus like, I think we should have this as a policy because it solves a problem. And I think that might be some of the disconnect, especially if we talk about like the difference between religious groups, and like Catholics are fascinating. The Catholic Church teaching on abortion differs quite a bit from what public opinion shows Catholics think about abortion. So I think some of that is a mismatch between what the problem is and the policy solution. So I'll stop there. Michal, you can go ahead and share.
And I could listen to you keep talking for a while, so keep going. So I have always been, I love when these reports come out from PRRI because I'm very much interested in the intersection of religion and views on abortion. And PRRI is one of the few places where this intersection is highlighted and complicated. It really, this data always complicates the larger narrative. I was just on a panel last week with a bunch of lawyers and asking these questions about, well, and the presumption of the moderator was religion is opposed to abortion. And we were able to pull out very quickly, years of PRRI data that complicates that picture. So the first thing I just want to kind of emphasize, and Melissa, you already said it, but that majorities across most religious traditions say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. This has been the case for many years, actually, across most religious traditions. This isn't new. And in fact, support has increased after Dobbs among some of the minority religious traditions like Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants. Their support for abortion has increased post-Dobbs. So I think that's just a really important thing to kind of highlight and name. And that's one takeaway that I have from the survey that I want folks to walk away from. And I know whenever I teach using this data, people are just shocked for exactly the reason that Anne just said, which is that so many of these religious traditions or religious leaders proclaim opposition to abortion, and yet the public feelings about abortion are much different and really inconsistent with some of the public statements, which raises a question about religion and public life and politics and things like this. But it's important to just bring out where people are actually identifying at this point. And then the second point I want to raise is about this religious participation or engagement, or Melissa, what you called religiosity. This is a really interesting set of questions that PRI is asking. I actually don't recall seeing this on previous reports. I don't know if this is new. Melissa, can you? Is it
I think this is new for this report.
for this report?
We ask those questions regularly, but we decided this time to include it as a different sort of analytical frame. But
Amazing.
it does exist, but you got to go back into the archives. But it's
Okay.
available.
Okay.
So
Got it. Got it. Okay. So these are questions that are similar to questions that Pew asks also about religiosity and religious identity. And it really forces us to dig a little bit deeper. As an anthropologist, I really appreciate moving beyond the how do you identify question as just a label and into the what does that mean for you? Because it is true, people often identify with a religious tradition, and two people who identify with that tradition might be practicing or believing or enacting that religious life in totally different ways. So some of these questions are really interesting. So the ones that PRI is using is, how often do you read a religious text? How often do you donate to a religious institution? How often do you attend religious services? And how often do you pray at home? And that helps us get at a more in-depth set of questions, a set of beliefs and practices a little bit, because I think to some extent these questions are a little bit incomplete, right? I would ask more questions if I were constructing a survey, because to some extent these questions skew very heavily towards religious institutions, right? Attending services, donating to institutions, things like even scripture, which is seen as, canonical and institutional, and most people think of scripture as unchangeable. But it's not so much on the personal, private, the home religious practice. And there are no questions about belief, which is very live. I mean, one of the donuts that you showed, Melissa, is in fact that the most frequent religious practice is prayer at home, which is right, not institutional at all. And Pew has shown this too, that that's one of the most common religious practices that folks have, which shows that for a lot of Americans, religion is a home thing and not necessarily an institution thing, which might also get at, right, these high rates of unaffiliated folks. It doesn't necessarily mean they're secular. It just means they're unaffiliated with a religious tradition. So some of that is very interesting to me, but let me get back to the data. So the questions are exploring whether there's a correlation between one's engagement with their religious tradition and their support for the legality of abortion. And the survey results reveal that those opposed to abortion are more likely to be attending religious services, reading religious texts, or donating to a religious institution on a weekly or monthly basis. And to some extent, that might not be surprising to folks, right? It supports the idea that traditional religious institutions are propagating abortion stigma and opposition to abortion. These institutions might also be supporting some traditional gender roles, so someone more engaged with their religious institution will be less supportive of abortion. But what's interesting to me is that it is important is that those supporting abortion do still report at a decent percentage weekly or monthly attendance at religious services. Like a third of them report weekly or monthly attendance at religious services, reading religious texts, same a third, and donating to religious institutions, which means that those supporting abortion can't really be described as secular or completely unaffiliated, right? They are, to a significant extent, engaged. So again, it's challenges. This is what I love about the PRRI data. It challenges this narrative we have, this dichotomy of religion between religion and abortion. The result that's curious to me, and I'll just go back to it, is this praying at home. So what does it mean, right? Those who are opposed to abortion legality, 68% report praying at home on a weekly basis. And at the same time, those who are abortion legality supporters, 37% report praying at home. So these rates of participation are the highest among all religious activities polled. In other words, the one that's most common is praying at home, as I said. Maybe it's saying that praying at home is really common. That's one thing, just that is a common religious practice, and it is. Or maybe it's demonstrating that there's a certain marginalization of religious institutions for both supporters and opponents of the legality of abortion. Maybe it's saying that religious institutions are not necessarily what's informing anti-abortion perspectives. And this resonates with me because of the research that I've done with my team on Jews, Christians, and Muslims who have had abortions, who will say things, some of them will say things like, I know my religion is opposed to abortion, but I needed to have an abortion anyway. And when we dig deeper, how do you know your religion is opposed? Are there sermons? Are there whatever? They can't name something specific. It's not like they've heard a sermon about this. It's not like their church is sending out a newsletter opposed to abortion. There's just this kind of idea in the ether. And I think part of that is because of this narrative that we have about religious opposition to abortion. I would be very curious to see how this data about religious practices and beliefs breaks down across religious groups. Is prayer at home more common among evangelicals, Catholics, right? And perhaps PRRI already has this data, right? And how are those different activities influencing perhaps views on abortion in different ways for different religious groups? So that's something I'd be very curious about. I'll stop there.
Terrific, Michal. Thank you so much. I couldn't agree more that I think one really great thing about our data is it does complicate those narratives, right? And so if also we had $1 million, I would love to include more questions on religiosity. Unfortunately, oftentimes we are met with kind of limitations for just how many questions we ask. And we try to pick, I think, the questions that probably elicit the most common sets of commonality, or things that really you could see people doing across a range of religious kind of faith traditions. But your comments are certainly well received here. The other thing too is we actually do have some data. Last March, a year ago, we published a study called Religious Change in America, and we do have a breakdown of kind of those religious behaviors by different religious traditions. So, and that report does have abortion attitudes. So that might be something for a future spotlight, Michal, that you might want to write. So that data definitely exists.
On my to-do list. Got it.
So I'm going to actually, I also should say, I'm going to just turn a little social sciencey here for the audience. My apologies. But in our larger report, we really talk about how those elements of that religiosity scale we discussed hang together in terms of statistical analysis. So we kind of talk a little bit more about that in the report. For the real, social science nerds in the audience, you can go find that. But thank you for bringing all these terrific points up. I hope you don't mind, Michal, but I kind of want to keep you on the hot seat. We're going to kind of reverse the order here and I have a question for you. And also on the side, please, if you have questions, feel free to the audience, feel free to kind of submit them via the Q&A box here. So my question to you, Michal, is, one of the things that we found that's kind of intriguing, and some people have noted, is these attitudes about banning the abortion pill. And there's been some talk among some, I guess, Republicans in Congress to invoke the Comstock law. It seems to be in vogue now for, some people in Washington to evoke laws that are centuries old, right, in order to advance certain political aims or policy goals. But on the Comstock law, this was a law in the 19th century that was really tried to prevent, obscene materials from being distributed, including birth control at the time. But viewed differently, some people think that this is an avenue through which to limit access to medication abortion, essentially. So, but we do find here that there is more opposition to that policy than you might be led to expect, given overall attitudes about abortion. So I just wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about why you think we're finding that to be the case.
Yeah, this is a great question. I was also really curious about this. So first, also just to emphasize, not only are they kind of thinking about implementing the Comstock Act, but there have been attempts. So in April 2023, a federal judge in Texas ruled in favor of anti-abortion organizations suing the Food and Drug Administration because of their approval of mifepristone, which is one of the two medications used in medication abortions. The FDA approved these pills more than 20 years ago. They've been used by more than 5 million people in the US. And before that, they were used in Europe very safely to end early pregnancies. More than half of abortions today are medication abortions, and that medication is safe and legal up to 10 weeks. So, as you said, enforcing Comstock is deeply unpopular, as we see from the PRRI survey. My thoughts about why there's some discrepancy around religious groups that seem to be opposed to laws that will ban the shipping of these medications across state lines, while generally not being overly supportive of abortion, is I have a few kind of hypotheses about what might be going on there. And I don't think we know for sure. And I could be convinced one way or the other. So I think one thing that might be happening is that many people don't know how common the abortion pill is used in abortion care. So if they don't think it's that big of an issue, then they might not think it's worth legislating. In fact, and this is kind of a subpoint, some of these groups that are generally opposed to abortion might also be opposed to government overreach. So they might be opposed to regulating the U.S. Postal Service any more than it already is. And so if they don't think abortion medication is that big of a problem, they don't want the government to be involved. So they don't realize, however, that most abortions, over 90%, occur in the first trimester when abortion pills can be used. I think they might have an impression of abortions being more common later in pregnancy because of some of the ways in which anti-choice or pro-life groups talk about abortion, of fetal life, and the images that are used are often of fetuses terminated in the second or third trimester. Those are very, very, very uncommon. And so, but I think they might not realize that, some of those groups. I think it's possible, though unlikely, that these groups might be aware that abortion pills are also used for miscarriage management, and they don't want them, banned then from shipping, because it would mean that doctors across the country wouldn't be able to access these pills for miscarriage management. I think it's unlikely that they are trying to preserve the pills for miscarriage management, but it's possible. I'm just kind of throwing it out on the table. But maybe, and this might be where there's some light to see, some goodness perhaps, is that if people are supportive of using abortion pills, in other words, if that's what these statistics say, that among these groups that are generally opposed to abortion, they seem to be supportive of the abortion pills, it means that even those groups that are opposed to abortion are actually much more supportive of abortion in the first trimester. And this would be an interesting finding to lift up, because of all the states that are advocating and have already enacted 6-week abortion bans, which we also know from this data are very unpopular, right? There might be some room, right, to make legislation that allows for most abortions in this country to proceed. That's a thought. And my final kind of guess at why there's this discrepancy is, unfortunately, that there might be some confusion about the question. And I'm not a survey author, so I don't really know. But the question is a double negative, right? It's, are you opposed to laws that make it illegal to ban shipping pills? And it's possible that people were confused by the question, but I don't know.
Great. Those are all interesting hypotheses. On the double negative, we do ask Americans, do you support or oppose the policy, but we're just presenting the oppose. So sometimes you have to do the mental logic, but I see your point that sometimes if you present it as a double negative, but we do ask, I think, essentially, do you support or oppose these kind of bans?
That's great to know. So it really is. So right. Okay. That's great to know. Okay. And
Yeah.
I wonder, can you say these are people, if they oppose bans that make them illegal, is it then that they support the shipping of abortion pills? Can we draw that conclusion? Or
I think we could do a crosstab. That's one
Okay.
we should also look at. Absolutely. I think that's a good point there. I do wonder too, and I don't really have any data to verify this, but when you put something like FDA approved in front of the line as well, like maybe you're signaling to people, oh, this is a safe drug. And so maybe that's something else that would be, I've thought about that too, why we see that sort of discrepancy as well. as a possibility, certainly. And let's turn to you as an expert in state policy. So I'm just kind of wondering if maybe you could speak about what's happening right now in the politics of abortion referenda. Do the findings that you see today maybe help us to understand the current electoral environment? What can we expect moving forward? And then this is maybe a question that we could end with and get Hill's thoughts on as well. You know, in 2022, we saw that abortion really played a big role in the midterm races, but it seemed to really dwindle in importance as a salient issue to voters in the 2024 presidential election and state elections last fall. So let's start first with kind of your take on where we are with the politics of abortion referenda and maybe what the data might say about that.
Right. So kind of related to that and what Michal was saying, I actually think in terms of the language around abortion pills, I mean, I live in a state where we did vote on the legality of abortion, and a lot of the messaging was about the connection between abortion medication being used for miscarriage management. So I would be interested to see in states that have voted on it, because for a lot of abortion rights groups, that was a lot of the messaging that was being pushed, was that if we ban abortion, you won't have access to miscarriage management. If people are more opposed to those rules because they are making the connection there. I'm not sure if you are not exposed to that, if you would know that connection, but that's interesting. So anyway, so yeah, lots of states have voted on abortion. What we generally see is that, I mean, I looked, and you can find this on PRRI's website. I compared the results of ballot initiatives on abortion and reproductive rights to the results of the 2024 election. And what we see is that abortion rights are more popular than Kamala Harris was, so across the board. And they actually, if you look at the states that voted in 2024 and you look at the PRRI data on support for abortion rights, the percentage of people that vote in support of abortion rights is very close to PRRI's percentage of people that support abortion rights. There were a couple states where you see a gap, and I think some of that is because of the particular language in the ballot initiative. We know political science research shows that the exact language can matter a lot for the ballot initiative. So if it's very long, very complicated, overly technical, it can confuse people, and so that might cause a discrepancy. One of the interesting things that we saw was that South Dakota voted to expand access to abortion, but the initiative was actually not supported by most pro-choice groups, by most abortion rights groups, because it didn't go far enough for them. It only expanded access to abortion through the first trimester. And so you saw in South Dakota, I think PRRI's data shows that a majority of South Dakotans support abortion rights or abortion access, and only like 40% of voters did, which could be both that South Dakota, is kind of a close state if we're looking at getting a majority vote, but also you could have some people who support abortion access but didn't want to vote for that ballot initiative because they didn't think it went far enough. They didn't think it provided enough access. So I think the particular language really matters for some of this. Lots of the ballot initiatives have fetal viability as part of the initiative. And so that can kind of take away the argument used often by pro-life groups that this initiative is going to allow for late-term abortions, right? So again, I think the language really matters. But what we do know is that it's more popular than Democrats, right? Because we have support from both people who identify as Democrats and identify as Republicans. The difference I think we see between looking at like 2022, 2024, and what we might see in like 2026 is the difference between voting in a midterm election versus a presidential election. What we know is that turnout is always greater in a presidential election. So you're just going to get more people who may not have voted otherwise turning out in 2024, right, than they would have turned out in 2022. That was a really mobilizing issue in 2022 for Democrats, right, because it was right after the Dobbs decision. And so it was one way to express your discontent with what happened at the Supreme Court. Right? But in 2024, people were voting for many different reasons, right? That wasn't the sole driver to go to the ballot. So I think what else is on the ballot also matters a lot for how these initiatives do. The last thing I'll say is that in some of these states, you need more than a simple majority to get the measure passed. So we saw in Florida, they need a 60% threshold. So even though a majority of Floridians voted in favor of their initiative to expand access to abortion, it did not pass because it wasn't 60%. So that's something you have to keep in mind too with some of these states, is that there might be majority support, but you need super majority support to actually pass it.
Thank you, Anne. I tend to also think too, compared to 2022, because actually maybe one irony of having these statewide referenda appear is that maybe it sent the signal to some people, well, I can vote my my choice on reproductive rights, but then I can still make a different choice for president, right? And I think that really wasn't the case, when it came to the 2022 midterms. And I do think that the immediacy of that decision really changed the nature of the midterm elections. Whereas I think you're right, in 2024, other things were on the ballot. Our own research at PRRI found that, of course, it's the economy, as other survey firms have found too, that it was the economy and inflation, and maybe to a lesser extent, immigration, that seemed to really drive people's vote choices in 2024. Right, so we have a couple of audience questions here. So one is, Texas is one of 4 states that ban providers from mailing abortion pills and has some of the most restrictive abortion laws. Yet 59% of Texans support legal abortion in all, or I would say, or most cases. So what factors explain the gap between public opinion and state policy? So I'll open it up here to our guest if they want to take a first shot here.
And I defer to you on that one. You have answers.
I mean, I think some of this gets to, again, we sometimes have this gap between, responsiveness and public opinion, right? Democrats are always going to be in the legislative minority in Texas. So even if a majority of Texans, and it's not just going to be Democrats, obviously, that support abortion rights, if they don't have the votes in the legislature, and they certainly don't have the votes from the governor is not going to be signing any legislation into law. So I think that's where you see the disconnect is depending, and Democrats tend to be concentrated in more urban areas, right? So there's just not enough representation of people who support abortion rights throughout the state to make a difference that way.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree. And I think you also have to remember the longer game of abortion politics. You've had Republicans you have activists who oppose abortion have for decades tried to plant the seeds of trying to eventually overturn Roe, but also passing legislation that before Roe was overturned, that made it very restrictive. They made those policies very, very restrictive, right? These trap bills and other things. And so, and because you mentioned earlier, Anne, partisan gerrymandering is very hard for Democrats in those red states to actually get more representation in those state legislatures. So I think it's just a function of really gerrymandering and having a certain party be in the majority. And it's really hard, I think, for opponents to that position to really, I think, gain much traction, even though that viewpoint is held by a majority of state residents in a state like Texas. All right, next question. Were there any states besides Colorado that passed ballot initiatives that were more progressive than the Roe v. Wade standard, or when it comes to viability?
Yes. So New York, their proposal was a broader ban on sex and gender discrimination. So it didn't have any mention of viability. And Maryland's also provided a fundamental right to reproductive freedom. Both of New York's and Maryland's were first in the legislature. So it's a technical difference. There's ballot initiatives that are first started in the legislature and then sent to the voters. And then there are some that are started among the voters. That's what happened in Colorado, is you get people to sign up to have this thing put on the ballot. So Maryland and New York, it started, the legislature voted on it, and then they had the citizens vote on it. Colorado started from the grassroots, but all three of those, there was no viability language in there.
Thank you. That brought me back to my days of teaching state and local politics and the differences between initiatives and referenda. You know, it gets very wonky there. It's a vestige of the progressive era in lots of ways. But in some states, there's not even that option. It's just the state legislature, and then the governor supports it or vetoes it. We have a question for Michal. We want to know, can you speak to how different religious groups differ in their views on abortion? So, for example, why are Hispanic Catholics a little different from Hispanic Protestants?
It's a great question, and I'll speculate a little bit, like informed
Yeah.
speculation, but I'm not an expert on Hispanics. But what I would say is a few things. One, so Hispanic Protestants, from what I understand these days, are leaning more conservative. They're more in line with white nationalist beliefs, which we could probably see along one of those charts that PRRI has. So they might be expressing beliefs that are just more in line with those right-leaning Protestant groups, other white-leaning Protestant groups. And there's still a gap between Hispanic Protestants and white evangelical Protestants. I don't want to say they're overlapping. There's at least a 10-point gap between them in terms of how they're thinking about abortion. But there is something there that they might be leaning more towards the right on that. And among Hispanic Catholics, my speculation would be, first of all, Hispanic Catholics are aligned much more closely with white Catholics. White Catholics are actually more supportive of the legality of abortion than Hispanic Catholics, just by a couple of percentage points. But I think Hispanic Catholics might also be informed by some liberation theology, which emphasizes social justice, alignment with the needs of the poor. And for so many years, abortion rights movements have emphasized that this is a social justice issue. And so that might be what's influencing Hispanic Catholics to be more supportive of abortion than Hispanic Protestants. Those are my speculations.
We have one final question. This is specifically for Anne. If there's time to follow up here, could you break down the New York initiative a little bit? She said she was confused, this viewer, by the language and what it was actually doing. This person lives in Indiana, but is from New York, and many of her family members had no idea about the initiative. So maybe just really quickly, if you feel comfortable and explaining that a bit. Anne.
I actually don't know the details of New York, but I think this does get to the point, right? Which is sometimes these initiatives or referenda are very straightforward. It's like, we will not have abortions. We will not allow for abortions after this week, right? Whereas with New York's, because it's based in this larger language about sex and gender-based discrimination, right? There's lots of like inferences that you have to make. And so it does not surprise me, right, that people were confused about what exactly that meant. I don't have in front of me the exact language of it, so I apologize. I can't speak more to it.
That's okay. Next time, just know all 50 states. We want details, Anne. I can't believe almost an hour has passed, actually. So we're going to wrap up here for our webinar. I'm really so grateful to Anne and Michal for sharing their observations and their thoughts about this important study. I'd encourage the audience, please share the results of our findings online, on social media. Please follow us. We're on YouTube. We're on Blue Sky, we're on Threads, we're on LinkedIn. Our tentacles are out everywhere. We also just have launched a new Substack as well. So stay tuned for more analysis and commentary on our Substack piece as well. Please, though, but follow our work. Donate if you'd like to. We're a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization. So anyway, thank you so much, Anne and Michal, and I'm looking forward to seeing you two in person tomorrow